Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this virtual town hall tonight. We're coming to you live from the studio, and tonight's town hall, the topic is how lockdown has affected our ability to deliver community safety. With us live in the studio, we've got Alderman J.P. Smith, MACO Member for Safety and Security, and Councillor Brandon Golding. We're going to run this in a webinar format, so please put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll run through them in a moment. So we're going to start off with opening addresses by the two panelists, and we hand over to you in the studio.
Good day, thank you, Ian. We are socially distanced. I'm not sure, we can't reach, so for the purpose of this webinar, I think we're just going to remove the masks. We are distanced just so that you can see us properly and can read our faces. Thank you for joining us. This is in answer to many questions which have been raised around lockdown, how we deal with various situations, be it around homelessness, be it around being locked in your house, be it around how we deal with cleansing and issues which have impacted on us in the city. So we've asked you for previous questions which you've mailed through. We've also asked that you enter any questions post this in the message box, and we'll try best to answer it as we go through. Alderman Smith will indicate to us from a safety point of view and a social point what the impact has been on the city and on our ward based on lockdown regulations. Debbie, welcome.
Hi, Brandon. Okay, so I think that to do a quick short summary on the matter is difficult because it has become so complicated. But I think in a nutshell, what people need to understand is that you are dealing with a series of changes in the law that has made it, and you said this is okay to come off, huh? We're not going to get a fine.
Hopefully not.
No arrests. Okay. We're dealing with a set of changes in law that are making it very difficult for the city to keep public open spaces managed in the way in which the public expect. The dynamics from 10 years ago to now are different. We've got a series of legal issues, starting with the Gelderbloem and 7 others matter, proceeding with the implementation of the lockdown regulations, the court ruling around Singabalapa tented camp on Observatory Main Road, and of course the SAHRC court ruling. So these Disaster Management Act regs and these other provisions have created an environment within which our law enforcement aren't able to uphold the city bylaws as the public expect. And the net consequence of this is that you have an increasing number of tented camps going up. I think we started before the lockdown with 3 intermittent ones, and we're now dealing consistently with I think about 440 of them. So the problem has expanded. This has particularly impacted on parks and recreation areas. And so definitely a new challenge for us. We have mechanisms that we will be deploying in response to this, but many of those depend on the lockdown regulations coming to an end, as they are extremely prescriptive. And we have remedial measures that we're doing from a social development point of view that do not relate to enforcement or policing, because there are many of these problems that you can't primarily solve with policing. You can at best try and manage them, but they have far more fundamental problems. And some of those, of course, are macroeconomic in nature, as the unemployment rate has increased, and in the absence of a meaningful social safety net, we're just seeing more and more people finding their way onto the street in one form or another. So these are complex matters to summarize in a few minutes, but I can tell you that I've been through many public meetings over the last weeks, and the issues in suburbs like yours, like your ward, have boiled down to basically issues of homelessness. There are certainly other crime matters and property crime issues that impact, but I'll be led by the questions.
Great, thank you, JP. So what we've had is a lot of feedback saying homelessness has grown during this time frame. It's been there, but it seems to have exploded. And people are saying that the city's done nothing. So can we explain maybe just what is limiting us with regards to lockdown regs. Many people don't quite understand fully what the regulations are, what the limiting factor is, what it is that we can do or can't do. In terms of the lockdown regs, which you've mentioned, you also mentioned the Gelderblom judgment, which started this whole process with us. And then finally, we've got the HSRC court case, and the City of Cape Town is currently going to the Supreme Court of Appeal on that matter. Could we maybe just unpack that, because people don't always know what the detail is, and we perceive they know. So if we can maybe just start with where it started with Gelderblom, which really, we were at a jumping off point around stronger dealing with this, and then it stopped.
So I think if you take the time to go and look at what's happened to cities like San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, Seattle, they are picking up massive problems with homeless people, which COVID has accelerated dramatically. This is not different in many European cities, just not well documented. Informal settlements are becoming a reality in Europe as well. And I think that the challenge is that we have traditionally responded with a mixture of enforcing our bylaws to make sure people don't erect structures in public places, which are supposed to be communal spaces that everybody has access to, and social development interventions. So on the social development interventions, those would include things like the outreach units that go and speak to homeless people. I've been out with them several times, including in the CBD, around the Brandweer Park, Brandweer Street Park, around the Van Riebeeck Park, de Waal Park, and many others, other spaces where I've watched the outreach workers engage face-to-face with homeless people, encouraging them to come off the street, offering them alternatives. And these generally have consisted of, have been met with either a limited agreement or a general rejection. There isn't much enthusiasm amongst homeless people for reintegration and assistance. We have linked those to EPWP jobs so that people who do come off the street are able to get assistance with employment, because to give a home without an ability to stay in that home is meaningless. Then you're back to cardboard city. One of the questions that was posed before this started was a question from somebody about linking the question of homelessness to inner city housing provision, and I can tell you that that's actually not the solution. In the case of Cardboard City many years ago, the business sector and government got together, provided a range of homes, and those homes were in fact very briefly occupied by the homeless persons who were placed in, because they didn't have the means to sustain those. So the first time there were significant economic pressures or other crises, the homes were sold to others, and over a period of 2 years, almost none of the original occupants still lived in those homes. And we saw similar scenarios playing out with TRAs and other interventions that we've made. So sustainability is key there. The person needs to have employment first. And so many of our interventions have been focused on linking people to the reintegration unit, to getting them back to the family, to getting them back to a community where they have a support network, providing employment, providing counseling, counseling in relation to substance abuse problems, which very often are the root cause of being on the street. And these interventions have been matched with the shelters in terms of the winter readiness program, providing additional bed space when the weather is most inclement, as well as the expansion of the safe spaces so that people are able to take that first step off the street into suitable accommodation, that initially being very informal, because that's what people on the street indicated they wanted. Less formal structures. They didn't want to be held up in shelters, which have much more rigid rules and structures. So the safe space was very much designed around the needs of people on the street as we were surveying them. So the range of interventions has traditionally been with the majority of our intervention or response, matched then by the appropriate application of our bylaws, which we apply consistently to everybody. And over the last year and a bit, I think what has changed is that our bylaws now are not able to be effectively applied to everybody, and the public are seeing what the consequences of this are. So maybe in the past, if you thought, well, the city does nothing, what the city was doing was preventing the scenario that is currently unfolding itself. This is what it looks like when the city does nothing. And if we're not doing what the public expect us to do, it's largely because the law very explicitly prohibits it. The Singa Balapu court ruling prevents us from applying our bylaws. Judge Hockey called the application of our bylaws to people harassment. But we think that the judge erred substantially in this regard, and we're appealing that matter. The lockdown regulations, which have been legally challenged in court unsuccessfully, say that no structure is allowed to be demolished or removed. A structure including tent or other a structure built by a homeless person is allowed to be demolished or removed, even if unoccupied. And the SAHRC court ruling says that we cannot counter-spoliate. So counter-spoliation is when somebody starts building a structure to prevent us from getting to the scenario where the PI Act then kicks in and offers the person protection in law. We counter-spoliate. We take such law enforcement actions as are required to prevent those spaces from being occupied. Now, a good example here is what's happening in District 6. So these same rules that have now been made by national government and these court rulings have the implication for District 6 that as those structures that are being built there are no longer being able to be removed by us, as we did for years, those structures are gradually multiplying on the District 6 spaces. That will very possibly have the consequence of denying the District 6 land restitution beneficiaries from eventually being able to reclaim their land. It's going to deny them the ability to rebuild there, and that is going to give rise at some point now to a significant legal challenge. So we have faced with very challenging circumstances. The Gelderblom matter has lapsed. They were required to prove in court that our bylaws were unconstitutional, which they didn't only fail to do, they failed to even attempt to do. So that matter has lapsed. And within this legal framework now, we are doing what we can where we can. Remember that the scenario around homeless people building structures on public space is very similar to the land invasions we experience elsewhere. The one is just faster acting than the other, and a significant amount of resources are being demanded by communities to respond to those.
Okay, so if I can just jump in there. So what we're speaking about is the safe space, the Kullenborg safe space was our first one. We've tried it, it seems to have worked, we've learned lessons. It wasn't cheap.
Which was expanded to the second one adjacent to it.
So there's two of them currently. There's one, which is the Kullenborg one, there's the Kullenborg parking, there's Plain City, and then we've also lost certain spaces which we're hoping to utilize due to the refugees moving off Green Market Square. So we understand that there was an aim from a social point of view to find space to actually, to encourage people to physically go to. But the question still stands, okay, the street persons unit has gone out and has offered help to people, have offered them space, but people aren't accepting. The question now is, Gelderblom said, or Gelderblom limited us from executing certain bylaw portions. Then in terms of the disaster management regs, it says you cannot evict. An eviction, we need to be clear, as per our legal opinion, states any eviction. Measures have been
understanding that an eviction, yes, what is required by both the SAHRC and the Disaster Management Act regs was Regulation 70. I think the numeral is now 37. They require effectively the city to go to court to get a court interdict or an eviction application against each one of these occupation. We are in the process of doing that. We have just short of 400 urban sites, yes, that we are busy taking to court to deal with. And that is where we're, the next step that we have logically to take in terms of where the law guides us now.
Okay, cool. Ian, I think you've got some questions for us you'd like us to deal with.
Thanks, panelists. Yes, let's go through the first question. It's, when are you appealing the South African Human Rights Council case in the appellate division? Is there a timeline to that, please?
Yes, I think we've been trying to get a date for that appeal for the last 4 months or 5 months. So as soon as we're afforded that date, I'm not sure that the date has been set. Yeah. If it has, then Brandon, you have an update on that?
I know, as far as I know, these legal processes take a while. We've been in discussions with this. That does sit with City Legal and the appointed legal counsel. if we try to get to the High Court here, it takes us time. Try to get to the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein takes us even a bit longer. But we're trying really hard because our hands are currently very much tied by these regulations. We are hoping that the disaster management regs are dropped. If that happens, then this case isn't necessary. But we need to proceed. I think what is important is that the city's gone ahead with interdicts or applied for interdicts against 400 plus separate sites. Indications are that we need to itemize each site that we seek a interdict for. This is a hellishly complex process, but that's what we're trying. We're unable to enforce on that site because of these regulations. So
Brandon, I think the question was, when are we going to appeal? And I know that the last report we had from legal services is that they were seeking a date for appeal, and that it was now up to the courts to set that date. I'm not sure whether that may have changed in the last week or so, but the appeal from the city is as urgent as we can possibly make it.
Thanks, JP.
Thank you.
The next question is from Henry Mostert. It would be good to know what the city and management regard as workable solutions. Could you provide specifics around your plans, please?
So I don't, does Henry mean in relation to the situation with homeless people on the street, or are there other urban management issues that she's referring to?
I think it's relating to homeless people on the street. Thank you.
Okay, all right.
Maybe we should touch on what so we've capacitated in the city to at least manage spaces, to clear spaces, to open more spaces, and to intervene on the streets, be it via cleansing, be it via social offerings, or at some point via intervention. So we're waiting patiently for the regulations to be eased. We have capacitated staff, there are cleansing staff. We have set aside, I think, just in excess of 6 million rand of city funding to manage this as soon as the regulations change, or we get to court, whichever comes first. Part of this is the interdict on the 400 sites, and part of it is actually prepping works programs too. There's a carrot and there's a stick. So we're trying to give you an offer on the one side, but if you're not going to take our offer, we need to balance rights of the people on the street versus rights of the citizens to healthy spaces and clean spaces. And obviously not to lose land to land invasion. District 6 in this ward is of big concern. We have raised this multiple times, and this is part of the reason why Alden Smith has helped drive this issue around interdicts on these land sites, so we can physically act at some point.
So, I mean, I think, a workable solution is not for people to be living on the street. Let's be clear about that. No human being should live on the street. And people who try and enable other people to live on the street are not helping. There might be a short-term argument to be made for seeing a person in distress and assisting that person at that moment where they are. But long-term, you should not be enabling a person to stay on the street in one place. You can only think that that is an okay solution if you do so from the comfort of your own home. It is never feasible in the long term or in the interest of the people who are there. So the cities, that's the premise of the city's action. It is to move people off the street either through their voluntary participation in reintegration or rehoming, bringing them back to their families, supporting them with jobs and accommodation. We are working with the shelters to expand the shelter beds. We've created the safe spaces. So I think the lowest number of beds that was available during this winter was 34 during last winter. And that means that at any given night, whilst you certainly couldn't accommodate the entire number of people on the street, there was always beds for people who were on the street. Because remember, nobody goes to the shelter and stays there forever. So people who tell you the argument, oh, well, there are not enough shelter beds for every homeless person in the street, that's a nonsensical argument. It's somebody who really hasn't thought through the issue. Because you're not going to try and warehouse every homeless person in permanent institutional accommodation. You're getting people back to their families, you're getting them into jobs, you're getting them into more sustained self-care. And that's the goal here. So we can always help people back into the streets. There is a number, 021-480-7700. That's our emergency communication center number. And at that number, there are social call takers sitting who specifically deal with the issues faced by homeless people. They will connect those persons to social workers and reintegration workers who will go out, help them, get them off the street, get them into accommodation, connect them to jobs, connect them to opportunities and counseling. So that we are covering to the best that the local government can. And in fact, I'm not aware of another local government in South Africa who is doing what we're doing, have gone to these lengths to accommodate homeless people. If you travel around the country, you will see that that is so. On the enforcement side, we are doing the maximum that the law permits, which at the moment is comparatively little. So when structures go up, when the tent is unfilled and placed on the sidewalk, that structure is there for keeps under lockdown. And until the lockdown regulations are lifted, those are the scenarios.
Thanks, panelists. We're going to go on to the next question. This one's from Carl Schmidt. He asks, why must we live in the mess while we wait for the court cases? Can't we have teams to clean up the city every day?
Let me comment on that. So yes, we currently do dispatch cleaning teams. It's based on what is logged by various people. I implore people, please log, phone 107, log it on the city's website. All of these processes are driven by complaints. Solid waste did suffer during COVID. The impact wasn't just on homelessness. It did impact, as I think residents note, on the collection of garbage, on the street sweeping side. Our staff suffered. We have had staff who have died, but we also ask people to physically help us. At the safe spaces, we are driving jobs programs. As Albert Smith has mentioned, we are trying to get people into EPWP works programs, but there's a push-pull factor, and part of the pull factor is the economics in the city. COVID has made things hard, and people have come into what seems more attractive. So we ask residents to please help us. City's got a project or a program called, it's Project Dignity, or Give Dignity. And people want to help, but we ask that you help in a structured manner. We all work with various NGOs in the safe space, in food gardens where we work. Please help us there. But giving money to people on the street doesn't help them. We're asking that you help us give them a hand up, not a hand out. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to go on to a next question here. It's also from Carl Schmidt, and then we're going to go to some of the pre-asked questions, and we're going to take two of those, please, Brandon. So the last question on this round. It's from Carl Schmidt. How can we grow safe spaces and make sure people go there to sleep after COVID?
Okay, so I think we've answered part of that. Don't encourage people by giving them. Rather give to structured programs. Help us in these work programs. There are food gardens which we've activated, which are driving jobs. We have recommended that watchers do refer people. Through the 107 number, you can also contact social services. We will send out the field workers who do make offers to the street people. But what is happening currently is that by giving people food and giving them money, it discourages them from physically being there.
And I think the point to make is that you can't compel people to take up social development options if we offer it to them. You can't force them to. What does happen is when you issue a bylaw offense to somebody, and if they don't pay it, they are required to appear in court, and the court will then decide what to do with that matter. So we are enforcing the extent of our bylaws to the maximum extent that the law permits. So we issue a bylaw. If you don't pay the bylaw, the court will issue a warrant of arrest for you. The court's controlled by national government, and we will then give effect to that warrant of arrest. The person will appear in court. And what we experience in the vast majority of those cases, and that's more than 99% of them, is that the court will simply withdraw the charges or strike the case. So we are not getting much support from the criminal justice system in this regard, which means that our counter-spoliation efforts are limited and our ability to use the criminal justice are limited. So if I tell you that I think that we are largely dependent on the social development interventions and the reintegration unit, it's because I think the public have an expectation that the criminal justice system will deliver for them more than it is able to or will permit at this stage.
I think we can also touch on one more side, which has been raised often in certain park spaces, is that we've got foreign nationals staying in the CBD. And it's not just the issue with the criminal justice system. Often these people need to be dealt with by immigration. And insofar as we have struggled to get help in the criminal justice process, Home Affairs or immigration has also been a bit of a tough nut to physically crack. They have offered us help, and the offer of help is to train staff members in the city to actually do part of the job
It's just debatably legal.
of Home Affairs. So
There are effectively three groups of people that we find on the streets at the moment. The one is the increasing number of people urbanizing from areas where they're experiencing more poverty when they come to the city looking for opportunities. There are a substantial number of people being released from prison as parolees, which we're finding on the streets. And that has impacted on the crime dynamics in the CBD and the City Bowl. And the third one is the foreign nationals, to which Councillor Golding has referred to. And there we've had great difficulty getting the support from immigration enforcement in that those resources are now extremely scant and little able to support us where we need it.
Thank you. Another question that's come through here on the emails, and it's around visible policing. And can you talk briefly about some answers around what seems to be in this question? I'm just abbreviating here, a lack of visible policing.
So I think the point to make is that the public often don't understand the difference of who runs what. So the South African police are run by national government. They theoretically have somewhere between 18 and 22,000 staff in the city and are well under-resourced, probably a little bit less or a little bit better than a third of the resources we should have by international best practice standards, and around half of what seems to be the average across South Africa, according to the last answers obtained by the Portfolio Committee in the Western Cape Legislature, the Community Safety Portfolio Committee. And so there's not much we can do to directly impact on it. The Social Justice Coalition took national government to court to force them to bring more resources in Khayelitsha, which was one of the worst stations there. The police to deployment ratio was 1 policeman for every 880 members of the public. Ideal international figures are around 1 to 220. And at the moment, the city of Cape Town is hovering around the 1 to 560 mark. So we're not well resourced from a SAPS perspective. In response to that, the city has been trying to increase our policing resources in traffic law enforcement and Metro Police as best we can. The CBD benefited from 18 additional law enforcement officers deployed, and some of the councils also pay out of their ward allocation budgets for additional officers to be deployed, so-called rent-a-cops. We've also partnered with the city improvement districts who pay for additional staff on that same rent-a-cop program. And we're the only city in South Africa that has reservists. So we have a law enforcement auxiliary program that seeks to harness the public's willingness to volunteer rather than constantly trying to charge the ratepayers more and more money. So that's what we're doing to try and fix it. We have employed steadily year on year more staff, but I think COVID has brought us to a situation where that's not going to be possible for the next couple of years. We are simply not going to be able to plug the gap being left by national governments in adequate deployment with city resources, because there are just too many things competing for resources now.
What the city's also got in our space is its auxiliary law enforcement officers, and we've got a very strong complement, dedicated complement in this ward. But the ward is also a beneficiary of a trial. And for the first time, we've actually got a tourism unit within law enforcement. They are deployed generally to the Boerkamp area, to Tafelberg Road, and to Signal Hill Road. That kicked off last year, and we're seeing a growth there. It is a trial. We're trying to focus on this space, on the CBD, on those tourism areas. Tourism safety is paramount to us, but this is, again, it's a cost-benefit option, rent-a-cop option, where the city does rent out law enforcement resource, or it is funded via either SIDS or private entities. So we are looking at this. But if you look at numbers, the entire uniformed portion of Metro Police is less than the entire complement at Cape Town Central Police Station. So we don't have force numbers. City and the province have now put forward a LEAP program, but that is largely just aimed at a high crime rate areas. So we're looking at its creative ways to actually fund this. But we'll take any input from residents. We're working with SIDS. We are looking at the SID models where they pay for this. but we welcome anybody to who wants to join us as a volunteer in law enforcement. We are looking at these volunteer services, and we thank those who are currently doing it for their valuable service.
And perhaps just briefly worthwhile saying that there are several friends of different parks groups who are now looking at contracting additional security or intercops for the spaces that they care about, be it the Val Park or Van Riebeeck Park, and in turn signing an MOA with the city that will allow them to manage that space and even generate some revenue out of some activities there. Because if you're going to turn these spaces around, the most important thing is to get active usage of them. You need the residents in the area to take active occupation of those spaces. And so that's one part of the solution, certainly.
Cool.
Thanks, panelists. The next question is also an email question from Ingo Jastram, and it also deals with security and law enforcement, and the request via a petition of 450 people signed to put a security kiosk, and I mean that would be a law enforcement caravan on the corner of Glen and Baton Cunt Street opposite or around the old Robbie Nurek Hospital. Has that been looked at?
This is an extremely difficult thing, the request for kiosks, because effectively what you're doing with the kiosk is asking us to dedicate officers to that specific spot. And that's just not practically possible, because those officers are expected to work across a broad area and respond to all of the complaints, about 2,000 to 5,000 complaints per day. So it's not physically possible to pin the officers down to that structure. And if you put them in the structure and they're not in it when the resident gets to it, there's a complaint that they're not there. If they're in the structure and people see them sitting there, there's a complaint that they're not patrolling. So often the request for such is well intended, and it has the purpose of trying to secure a policing presence in that area, but practically not possible. I probably have over 400 requests like that at the moment citywide for kiosks in high crime rate areas, along smash and grab hotspots and so forth. And so they're extremely difficult to acquiesce with without bringing additional resources on board. But because if you are taking existing resources and locating and picking and pinning them down on that spot, what you're effectively doing is saying, well, take from resources that we're supposed to be sharing with the rest of the Atlantic, the City Bowl and CBD and other areas, and dedicate them to us alone. And unfortunately, there are one or two requests like that within every community. And so that's just not practically possible, much as we would like to be able to do that.
Thank you, panelists.
Can I just add to that? So we have met with members in the Gardens in Frederick area, looking at certain problem spots. And while the city is not able to dedicate law enforcement officers to that space, the olive branch was extended. We have found the caravan to be placed in that spot as requested. And the question was, are you able to put down a safety role play in that space? This was indicated. The caravan is waiting, or the caravans are waiting. That was committed by ourselves. So this is the partnership. Is this done via a SID? Is this done via armed response company? Is this done via a neighborhood watch? So this has been posed previously, and please raise it with us, but this is partnership. So please join us in that. Thank you.
Thanks, panelists. I'm going to ask you just to keep the answers as brief as you can, because I've got a whole pile to come here still. We're going to cross over to the live questions. Thanks, Vito, for your question. And the question is, can the SID stop pushing homeless people up into the residential areas? For you, panelists?
So I don't think the SIDs do that consciously. It's an inevitable outcome of the fact that the enforcement exists at a greater to a greater extent in one area, augmented by the SID, and not by, and then the displacement to areas with lower levels of enforcement. So it's not a conscious decision that the SID takes to do so, but a consequence of the heightened level of policing that they establish.
Okay, thanks. So we're going to go on to the next question. Thanks, Joanne. The question is, what is the situation at Safe Space at the moment? What is its capacity under the current lockdown restrictions, and are there any spaces available?
Short answer, yes. I've been past both the Safe Spaces recently. They're both well below maximum occupancy. Obviously, in terms of the population certificate, we're only able to have half as many people in those facilities as possible. We've had to create bigger spaces, but the amenities continue to exist there, and the ability to use it as a springboard to assist people to locate elsewhere in the city into other shelters that have capacity that exist. The important thing is to have a starting point of engagement with that person. As soon as there is a commitment or willingness to move to that first step of assistance, we will make or do what it takes to get the person the help they're looking for, but there has to be that willingness to take that first step. And my experience, certainly with the reintegration unit, is that by and large, that is absent for a variety of reasons in terms of the groupings we've described before, the foreign nationals, very often because of further plans they have to move elsewhere and to board ships for that purpose, as they've explained to us on site. And in the case of some of the parolees, for various reasons that they're not willing to reintegrate or relocate. So there are a variety of things that anchor people where they are. And the point that Councillor Golding was making earlier is that the campaign for the city asking people not to donate directly to people on the street is well-founded and endorsed by many of the NGOs. Rather donate to those structures that are assisting people who have committed to reintegration.
Excellent, thank you.
What we are planning is the city put out an advert in the media, I think it was in September last year, advertising for extra space. So the city's looking to open up extra safe spaces around the whole metro. I think the hopeful plan was 10 extra spaces. I don't think that'll all be happening in the short term due to COVID budgets, but we are looking at adding to this space. And there's definitely partnership around this. City cannot do this long term on its own. So it will be in partnership with various NGO role players, and we'll look at how we fund that and how we operate that.
Thanks, panelist. I'm going to send this next question from Henry to you, JP. Is it legal for people to camp at traffic intersections? It seems rather dangerous.
So effectively what the lockdown regulations does is it prevents us from removing the structures. So that's just the reality, that what we would have done in the past is apply the city bylaws. What we can do now is, under the lockdown regulations, is much less. And so you have a situation that's been created by regulations in national government and court rulings that are preventing us from taking the kind of actions that you expect us to take.
Great. Thank you. The next question I'm going to push on to you, Brandon.
Yeah.
It's from Brent Moore. Why not identify all unoccupied government land to accommodate homelessness?
Land is obviously a very topical question now with regards to its expropriation without compensation. City does look at all its open spaces. There's a fair amount which is identified for social housing, for gap housing. We're busy with the development framework for the whole of District 6. And in that model is a component for social housing. But there's land and then there's housing. Housing takes money. National government is in effect just cut huge swathes of our grant funding. Cities making up some of that funding loss with its reserves. But there's a long-term housing program, and this is just one of those aspects of it. So yet again, if we look at the Salt River Market site, it's a social housing partnership which the city's entered into with a social housing company. If we look at TRAs which we're building, the Pine Road site out in Woodstock is where we're trying to get people either out of shack-based housing or squatter sites, informal settlements, into formalized housing. But we have to be very careful with having a person being on the street for 5 months and jumping what is basically a 20-year housing list. So it's a very fine balancing act. Housing allocation policy does deal with homelessness, chronic homelessness, deals with people who are aged, people who have health issues. And if you want, there's a formal policy around this. But housing is a big issue in the whole country. And we're trying to deal with this in a compassionate sense within the limitation of what our funding is.
Thanks. The next question I've got is from Carl Schmidt, and it's all around dumping, black bins, And the question is pretty much about, the situation is problematic, the bin pickers, the bin scratchers, and perhaps a suggestion of padlocks or an e-waste dump in the city. Can you speak to perhaps looking at measures to secure the bin issue to prevent the mess from flying all over the CBD?
Okay, so let me touch on that. Firstly, we recommend that bins are only put out on the bin day. Now, I understand for the past few weeks, solid waste have been running slightly late and it's caused problems. I also know that people have used bin guards, which sometimes work, sometimes don't. We're looking at getting back on track with bin collections, but we also do ask residents to put bins out only on those mornings that is scheduled. Second to that, with regards to waste, e-waste will be accepted at the Woodstock depot site. I understand Carl's asking for a depot site in the CBD. Currently, we're not able to have that everywhere. That being said, I did pass a motion through the Sub-Council 16 last year with regards to recycling in the CBD, touching on all sides. It's a bit of a sore point my side because Sea Point Camps Bay was part of the pilot group. I can report that after much debate and much fight, it's actually budgeted for in next year's budget. The project kicks off as of July this year, which is the following budget year. All services are then planned for tender processing, and the commitment from Solid Waste is that as of the 1st of July 2022, curbside collection will happen in Ward 77. So that's been a big fight on my side, and I'm very proud to finally see that happen.
Should perhaps be pointed out that the activity of bin picking is not an offence in terms of the bylaws. So it's not that you can that we can apply the criminal justice system to persons doing so, and they are sorting through the bins because there's recycling material left in the bins. So the goal here is to try and increasingly drive recycling by residents and to increasingly move people picking through the bins as a way to sustain themselves on the street, to getting those people in formal employment with the at-source separation at the drop-off sites and waste sorting facilities, which is what previous recycling projects have done. So move people from informality on the street to more formal employment where they have more consistent guarantees and benefits. And that allows for integration because the bin picking on the street will rarely lead to the kind of reintegration that we're looking for.
Thanks, panelists. The next question from Corley. How can the social safety net be extended to actually help people on a continuous basis? A safety net is required to actually take care of these people, possibly forever.
I'm going to ask JP to speak to what the legislative mandate of the city is, because there's confusion at certain points. But what we do try to drive are works programs and jobs programs. So what was mentioned early on was the EPWP. It's the Extended Public Works Program. City of Cape Town does do short-term, almost stipend-based work, which is just a step up. But we also do funding to various NGOs. One of the NGOs which is operating in this ward currently is Streetscapes, and they work in cleaning programs, they work in composting programs, they are urban farming programs, where we get people into skill sets, into work. This is part of that step up the run. City walks a very tight line with regards to what its social mandate is, because part of this does lie with the province, and a large portion of it lies with national government. City of Cape Town, out of all the metros and all the municipalities in the country, I think spends the highest portion of budget of everywhere else. JP, you want to comment?
I mean, so we can't create a new social development or social welfare safety net. You can't issue grants to people to assist them. That is the domain of national government and overseen by provincial government. So what we can do is, as Brandon has said, focus on giving job opportunities where we can. We jumped in and provided food relief where we saw people were struggling during COVID, where national government was not responding adequately. And there are a variety of indigent relief measures to people in our city. We have the largest indigent relief package of all the municipalities, and we have a variety of relief to indigent persons, to the elderly and others. And in fact, a very large portion of property owners in the city are in fact exempted from paying rates as their properties aren't valued for rates or exempted from rates in the first place. So we've created as much of a social welfare net, I think, as is vaguely or meaningfully affordable by the city, especially under the current circumstances where we've lost around 2.2 billion rand from our budget with grant funding being withdrawn by government, and at the same time residents not able to pay, causing quite a substantial deficit in our income, which has led to us, or which has forced us to cut programs, to cut budgets, and to diminish our ability to serve the residents, which of course is a very problematic situation. And this has been compounded by the kind of crises with depots constantly being closed, like the solid waste depots. Every time a staff member is identified as COVID positive or suspected as such, it's compelled the closure of depots and the isolation of those staff. And we've tried to compensate with outsourcing in those cases, but it has really made life very complicated. And we've now more or less caught up on those backlogs, but it is at the moment much more challenging than it would be without COVID.
Thanks, gents. We've got 20 minutes left, so we're going to try and get through as many questions as we can. Here's a quick one. What does it cost per head to accommodate the number of homeless people in Cape Town, and what would that cost as addition to the rates bill? From Brent Moore.
That I think is debatable. It depends on what you incorporate in as part of that cost. There's an NGO, homeless coalition, that has recently published some documentation through Sam Foss and others on this, and they've attempted to calculate that figure. I would dispute the figure they've calculated, because they've added costs that they've ascribed specifically to homeless persons that I would say would be costs that the city would need to undertake in any case. It's not homeless specific. But that said, there is a substantial cost to having to encounter the circumstances that we do on the street, and the cleanup operations and otherwise. The question is, would moving those funds to the social development interventions achieve the reduction in people on the street? We experimented with that 2-3 years ago. We reduced our enforcement orientation and put far more emphasis on the social development interventions, and our problem worsened substantially. So I don't think you can unfortunately withdraw the resources that tries to mitigate the crisis whilst you plan for the alternative solution. You unfortunately have to undertake them concurrently and gradually migrate. And for that, the funding is scarce, especially under the current circumstances where council's budget is receding in capacity to deliver on these kind of extra asks, especially where they're not local government mandate, they're provincial and national mandates. And we are having to jump in all over the place, be it gang violence, the LEAP units, marine enforcement, electricity, water. There's so many areas where other spheres of government, or specifically national in this case, around the water and electricity crisis, are falling short with bulk delivery, where we're having to compensate with localized solutions, and these cost a great deal of money. Water augmentation schemes and the maintenance of the Steenbras facility to mitigate the level of load shedding every time. These all cost a great deal of money, which the ratepayers in Cape Town are bearing, but there's a limit to the affordability of that. So we are working with the NGOs. Councillor Badruddin, who's the MACO member for social development and early childhood development, is engaging them at the moment and rewriting our policy to see what we can do.
I think what is also helpful is there's a focus on jobs. As I said earlier on, it's a hand up, not a hand out. So what residents may not know is that there are jobs programs and works programs happening in this ward. I've met with homeless working groups in this space. What residents may not know is that when you often think of a homeless person, you think of a guy who's unshaven, unkempt, looks bad, clothes are torn. We've got about 40 odd homeless people staying in the middle of the ward in a guest house. In a guest house, think about that. It costs them 50 Rand per day to stay there. You won't see them. You won't realize that they're newly ex-homeless. They're part of that run up. We're trying to get them off the street. Once they're earning 2,000 Rand a month, they start to step out of this space. So our focus is not to put you in a space and pay for it, because that's not sustainable. But what we are looking for is help run these works programs, getting them work. when the safe space opened, the waterfront actually offered us jobs. So when we get people
and
employed,
companies.
yeah, there were lots of companies. So when we get them into works programs, they then have choice. So we'll look at getting some entry-level place where they can stay at minimal cost, but then they choose, because that is true freedom and that is true dignity on their part.
Excellent. And you have to make the point that, and I know you said we must keep this short, but if you offer significant solutions in the CBD, you must understand that it won't diminish the homeless problem. You will get homeless people who are in the streets here currently off the streets, but more people will come to the streets here because this is where you're offering the solutions.
Great. The next question should be a quick one. It's probably for you, JP, from Anthony Rees. How did SAPS get it right to clear up gardens during the SONA without court orders?
This rests on their particular interpretation of the key points in terms of the national safety laws. They have an interpretation that says that they were entitled to clear areas that would cause a risk or imperil the safety. In terms of the safety plans they were making for SONA, there was a lot of unhappiness about the application of that and the extent to which it contradicted the lockdown regulations, but they were confident that the interpretation was correct. And so it appears that when I think national government wants to find solutions, they're willing to interpret matters in a manner that gets them their way. But otherwise, they're happy for us to carry on struggling in the circumstances we are. And it is because, I suspect, not the Minister of Justice, not the Minister of COCTA, and not the Minister of Police is sitting in meetings like this night after night, speaking to people and trying to understand their problems and discussing the solutions with them. Perhaps if they were, their take on this would be different, and the manner in which they dealt with the lockdown would be different.
Thanks, panelists. I'm going to group these next two questions together. They both revolve around drugs. The one is that it's a comment by Gianluigi, and who says they often see open drug dealers dealing drugs and injecting themselves nearby parks. And the second question is from Brad. TB HIV Care hands out hundreds of pink needles in the hope to prevent diseases. These needles are used all over the ward. Is this organization doing something that's legal, as we are encouraging a free drug culture in the area, worried that we're creating another health problem? So both on drugs. Thank you.
So there was the distribution of needles is not a transgression. It's a public health measure that has an unintended consequence. And I mean, I find myself reporting examples of where I see people, even around the Cape Town Civic Centre, shooting up or using drugs, and reporting that to the police and to the health department, who do have their own ability and capacity to interact with people and to try and pull them into some of the rehab facilities. The city's law enforcement and Metro Police make an inordinate amount of arrests, but on these small quantities of drugs, the convictions are paltry. The courts rarely impose any meaningful kind of penalty. I think it falls in the category of barely being worth the paperwork, but that doesn't mean we're not doing it. They are pretty consistently responding. I log these kind of complaints either by myself or by virtue of people sending them to me via WhatsApp several times a week, just around the CBD. I don't get a lot of complaints from the Upper City Bowl, but I do think that it is always useful for the public to log it. Understand that how we deploy resources in part depends on where our complaints come from. So we look at where the challenges are, and when we do operational deployment and planning, it responds to where those complaint patterns are and what the nature of those complaints are. And so certainly it's invaluable for the public to report these matters, not in a forum like this. It's good for us to know, but immediately on the scene to the city's control room for Metro Police Traffic and Law Enforcement and all of our other emergency services. That's the 107 call center, which from a cell phone you can contact on 021 480 7700. And please do log those responses. We have resources in the CBD that will be able to respond to them.
Thanks very much. We're going to put all those numbers and the link to this video up afterwards. A question for you. I'm going to skip a question, go straight to you, Brandon. The question is from Corrieda. If I'm approached by a person begging on the street, what are the steps I can take to make sure that person is contacted by social development and offered place in a shelter?
Okay, so firstly, we're working on this Project Dignity campaign. You will see posters up around the City Bowl, garden centers on board. There are contact numbers. You are able to refer people to the Street Persons Unit. If you don't have it, you can log it via 107. I've done this personally and had support on site within 15 minutes at certain times. Most of our homeless people actually know where to go. They can go to the Strand Concourse. The Street Persons Unit is based there. There are a fair amount of walk-ins there. Just about every homeless person in the city of Cape Town has been visited. There's a case file on them, and we do not use any law enforcement or any sharp stick until they've been personally interacted with 6 times. So our field workers would have engaged them and offered them help 6 times prior to law enforcement coming and issuing notices around contraventions and possibly fines. So often what you find is people know this well, but because money is easy and free food is easy, and during the height of COVID, carrier bags of Woolworths food was easy, they aren't taking up all these offers. So please help us by not giving straight to the people. You will find bins at various shopping centers. It's run Project Dignity. It's under those signs. If you want to help, drop it in those bins. If you want to donate, there are signs up. I think there are QR codes up as well, which you can help, and you can donate straight to these NGOs. That's how you help. But please do not give straight to the person. People do it because it makes them feel better, but it doesn't help that person. It keeps them on the street. So we implore you, send them down to the Strand Street Concourse, or ask them to speak to Peter Cookson next time he physically comes and chats to them.
Thanks, Brandon. The next question is linked to that one. I'm just going to summarize it for you. Are you planning an extensive information campaign around the Give Dignity project? Because it seems that the message isn't getting out there to everyone.
We've currently just done a relaunch of the new version of the campaign. We're trying to drive it in a much more online sense. We realized that the postery stuff didn't always work. So as I said, we are working with shopping malls, try to make it a bit more visible in your face. There is a whole new media campaign. It's coming out roundabout now, and the message has changed slightly. We are trying to work with neighborhood watches, with NGOs. So if anybody wants to help us and get that message out, please do contact us, because we'll use any channel possible, any newsletter, but the old scale poster didn't work. We're really trying to get it out. So we're asking you as residents and as neighborhood watchers and as NGOs and as the concerned citizens, please help us get this message out, because we all help them. It's not, the City of Cape Town cannot do it on its own. So you're our eyes and ears, and please do help us with this. I implore you.
Great.
Yeah, and we do 3 or 4 of these kind of meetings. I'm personally doing about 3 or 4 of them a week to try and get the message across. The mayor has just written a letter that will go into all the community newspapers that puts the facts very bluntly on the table. We have a Q&A that we published at the end of last year, an extensive Q&A that we circulated digitally and otherwise to answer each of these questions plainly and briefly so that people could understand the dynamics.
Thanks, excellent panelists. A quick one for you, JP. What is going to happen if you lose your appeal? And I suppose they're talking about the appellate court in Bloemfontein.
Well, there's part A and part B to it. Part A lapses when the lockdown finishes, as do the lockdown regulations themselves, obviously. And in fact, we were hoping that was going to happen in December, and then in January, and then in February. And so we continue to hope for the cessation of these regs, or at least the removal of the particular reg that is causing this problem, that regulation 70 or whatever its current number is. It changes with every iteration of the regulations. And it actually no longer has any public health implications. It's kept there, I suspect, largely for political reasons at this stage, in that it is facilitating the movement of voting patterns in some wards which are sensitive to that. So I think it's a slightly disingenuous reason for sustaining that regulation. The lapsing of the regulations will allow us to put to work these extra resources that Councillor Golding was talking about earlier. We have many more enforcement resources, along with the increased social development resources that are ready to start. So when the lockdown regulations go, we will be applying our bylaws diligently and consistently. And that's to every resident, whether you're homeless or not homeless. If you transgress a regulation, then it is up to the courts to make that discretion in terms of your the reason why you should not be held to task for doing so. Then the Part B of the SAHRC court ruling is in fact far more problematic, because it actually is a serious assault on Section 25 of the Constitution that says you may not arbitrarily be deprived of your property. And that is a fundamental assault against property rights as a whole. And it is placing that and the PI Act, which is actually extremely bad legislation. It's a framework act that was meant to be populated by regulations that have never been written, and I think purposefully and mindfully so by national government, that is driving the land invasions we see everywhere, and very violent land invasions. We've lost a huge amount of city-owned and private-owned land since July last year, when the SAHRC court ruling and challenges started. And I think they're purposefully so. And that Part B of the application, in fact, is a very serious threat to property owners, private and public. And I can't help but think that if they took place, that these kind of actions or land invasions took place on the front lawns of some of the learned judges who are making these rulings, that the rulings would in fact be very different.
Excellent. I've got a great pertinent question here from Cynthia. Cynthia, thanks for your question. And she says, it's time that we beat down the door of national government. They need to provide healthcare facilities for people in need of mental health assistance. The city has become the go-to for everyone to scream at because we have given up on the national government. How much more can the city do to help and take over from the failed national government's responsibility?
I think we've got a problem there because City of Cape Town is doing a lot more than it should. Part of these mandates aren't even funded. It means that we are doing certain things which is not funded. We are using your ratepayers' money to do stuff which national government should be doing or paying for. City of Cape Town, through our budget now, we've just sat in a long budget session, and we're looking at this because you pay a lot more tax than you pay rates, yet we're funding this out your rates. So we're looking at these mandates. We're looking at NGOs who will partner with us around stuff like mental health. We look at matrix clinics to deal with homeless people, which again is funded by the City of Cape Town. But I think ultimately, people, this is your voice that must be heard. The city will try, but you've got to speak to national government. I don't know. It's time that we act and protest and toy if need be, because we're looking out for the health of everybody. Or possibly we need to look at where that money goes. We've all seen media about billions of rands that have gone down various holes. Us as the custodians of your vote and your funds in the City of Cape Town, try to keep it as open and honest and fair as possible. But we need to point a finger at national government and say, what are you doing with our funds? We've just had works programs, streetscapes had funding for a few hundred posts, and all that money has just now disappeared. It's gone to SAA. So it's time that the citizenry stand up and say, enough is enough. We can make your rates money go only so far. If you want us to do more, we need to see where do we cut or do we charge. It's very difficult. We're trying to do this through looking at what our services are. Can we maximize revenue? Can we minimize our own cost? but we need to listen to you as the residents and the citizens, and we need to say, this is what we can do. There's a balance. What would you like us to do? And then this is what it will cost. City of Cape Town is a non-profit entity. We generate service charges to cover our operating costs. Do you want us to augment water? Do you want us to cut grass, which is our basics? Shall we build roads? Or shall we enter into the space of health and mental health, which lies with the province and ultimately national government? Shall we play in the space of social welfare, which again sits with SASSA? We're achieving it for a lot more because nobody's doing it, so we're doing it. But
a practical example is SASSA has discontinued the humanitarian relief they give to victims of fire and otherwise. So now if you see there's a fire in an informal settlement, you won't see immediate food relief as was previously the case. That function got turned to SASSA by national government. The city at one point did it on an agency basis for them. And so now it's very common for us to see no assistance to people unless there's a minimum threshold of people involved and people are willing to move to a hall, neither of which conditions frequently exist. SASSA is just not able or willing to assist the people in terms of the policies they drew up, policies that I think are somewhat self-serving. And so what this means is that there's the temptation for the city to yet again enter into yet another space to use ratepayers' funding to fund this. And it gets to the point where the burden on our ratepayers is unaffordable at a time when people are pleading with us to make this next budget that we approve affordable, to reduce dramatically our tariffs and our rates, to have a low increase in our rates below inflation. And I can tell you that we're taking this to heart. That is, depending on how the budget process comes out, that is what we're trying to make happen. But against that backdrop, it's very hard to add additional services and capacity and agency to the city. And we're constantly under pressure to do more and more of national government's function. On a policing level alone, that includes marine enforcement, metal theft enforcement, liquor enforcement, rail enforcement, gang enforcement. These are things which, when I became Maker Member for Safety and Security, the city didn't touch. It wasn't our business. It has now become our business.
And JP, that follows on to one of the questions here is how do we hold them accountable and to actually deal with the crime?
Well, can I put this, as Brandon was trying to do, back to their residents and saying some of you serve on neighborhood watches and CPFs. Thank you. Our neighborhood watches are doing brilliant work. They're invaluable to us. Myself and the mayor are doing a walkabout once a week with a different neighborhood watch in the city. We were in Salaris Pass Village last week, which was incredibly uplifting to discover a lady like Shirley who has delivered 13 babies and stopped somebody from bleeding out after a knife attack with the emergency life support training we gave her. So many of you are serving on structures like that and other civic and ratepayers associations that are perhaps represented to the CPF. So at that CPF meeting, stop asking about the visible policing component. It's like a conveyor belt. And what happens in the beginning of that process, the visible component of it, is only the first part. The rest of the criminal justice system remains shrouded in shadow. And that's where the wheels are falling off. That's where things are not working out, where you are not getting convictions for repeated house robbers, for people on the street who are parolees, who are getting arrested and whose parole is not being revoked. So this is where we need these civic organizations to increasingly focus their energy. When you're in that CPF meeting, pay some attention to the amount of police on the street and what's happening, but increasingly start asking the questions about how many of those arrests led to convictions. How many of the arrests led to somebody being charged? How many of the charges led to proper investigations and convictions? Because if there is not that complete process in the criminal justice system, then the work of the increasingly put upon and pressurized police officers will not work. And you will get police officers who are increasingly resorting to the wrong actions and pressurized actions and making mistakes and poor judgment because there's more and more pressure being piled on them. And all of that is for naught if the rest of the criminal justice system remains as dysfunctional as it has allowed to become in the hands of national government, who have exclusive control over that. We don't control the South African police, the NPA, the DOJ, or the DCS.
JP, thanks. We're gonna go on a bit because it's fair that we started late, that we should give everyone their 90 minutes. Quickly, a message that came through on the email is about reestablishing the community courts.
The community courts are close to my heart. It's something that when I became a ward councillor in Sea Point, I fought to get. There was a pilot program in Pretoria, in Tshwane. And after that pilot program, or while it was running, we were the first city in South Africa to establish 3 community courts: Mitchells Plain, Fezeka, and Gugulethu, and in the city in Baitington Street. And we basically had to roll out most of the resources to make that happen, even though it's a national government competency. We were trying to expand those community courts to all the magisterial districts. We have a MOA with national government, with the DOJ and the NPA, that took us about 4 years to get into place. And I'm afraid it's not moving because the ability and the capacity of the DOJ and the NPA to deliver on their portion of it is also not available. So this presents some very serious challenges. These are not things we can make happen on our own because those courts don't belong to us. We're not in control of them. At best, we can contribute resources. And as with many of these other failings that we refer to, you are already, as ratepayers, contributing substantially to the courts. We have 11 municipal courts, the most of any city in South Africa. These courts function on a daily or rotational basis around the city to deal with bylaw and traffic offences. We already pay for much of the cost of those courts from the court section and the Corporate Services Directorate, and certainly for many of the magistrates now. This is one of many examples of where your ratepayers' funds are going to pay for a system that we shouldn't have to pay for, but if we don't, it makes the whole rest of the process collapse where we depend on national government. And again, there is a limit to the affordability of how much additional rates residents can afford in this way.
Okay, excellent. So there's a few questions, and I don't think we're going to get through them all. I'm going to stick to the ones that are related to community safety, because that is the topic of tonight. And one of them is, when will the city set up a SID in the area, and why has this not been done yet?
Okay, so let me touch on that one. I've met with quite a few people around us. The SID, or Special Ratings Area, SRA, is a construct of the city. And it's not just the city of Cape Town, it happens nationally. But the city of Cape Town has seen a huge growth in SRAs. In the past while, Hart Bay, JP, it's your hood now. You used to live in Fairhoek. It's gone from 0 SIDs to 5 SIDs. SIDs are where residents pay a top-up levy, and all that funding is dedicated to that space where you as a resident base define what you want for it.
But it's up to the residents. That's the point you must make.
But this is up to you. I've encouraged people. I've met with multiple parties. About 7 years ago in the Gardens area where I stay, I did the actual modeling because the then councillor, Dave Bryan, said, Brandon, do you want to do this? So we modeled it then. The OH area have tried twice now. There was a bit of lack of interest for the uptake. I'm going to ask all interested parties to please email me. I have asked various role players whether they would at least entertain some dialogue and discussion around that. There seems to be a larger interest. We will unpack it. We will have information sessions. But if you're interested, please do it, because this is driven by you and your area and your community. There's a lot of support coming out of CCID, Cape Town SID, OK SID in Cliff Street, Greenpoint SID. They're all willing to help. But this is something that we need residents. This is your SID. This is not our SID.
Well, it's initiated by the residents.
Yeah.
So it's not something that the city can decide we want to apply to an area. There has to be an application from the residents. They have to initiate the SID application. And then the bylaw, the special rating area bylaw, defines a series of processes to go through for the SID to be established, and it requires the majority of 50% plus one support for the commercial SIDs, and I think it's a slightly higher threshold for the residential SIDs. And so this is very much community initiated, but there's huge benefit to the SIDs. They're certainly one of the most powerful urban regeneration tools that we have. That's why we have more than 40 of them in the city now already. They're common practice throughout the world. And in the areas where they run, we can see that they have an impact on property prices. So there's some enlightened self-interest for residents in investing in a SID, because over time, it will boost the property prices in the area beyond adjacent areas without SID. So you can see that within a common area with similar kind of properties and market. The ones within a SID with those additional top-up services will benefit from it. And it's one way where residents are able to directly control the resources that the SID gets. Those are ring-fenced, and it's for that, the board that controls it to decide how those resources are spent within the business plan that the community voted for.
Thank you. So SIDS are the way to go. There's been a number of comments here directed at you, Brandon, to please share details about the Give Dignity bins and the campaigns. And there are a lot of people wanting to get involved and help put up posters. So we shall share all of that information online. There's a comment here about the Haven Night Shelter. I'll read it to you. It says from I think it's Cynthia. I believe the manager at the Haven said the city does more than any other municipality in the entire country to help the homeless. Well done. I think we must remember that. More would be good, but this is very impressive. And although I'm super frustrated, I'm very proud to live here and support the DA. Well done. So that's not really a question. I'm sorry for that.
We try.
That's just a comment. Then Anthony Rees says we have a homeless prostitution problem happening around the Mill Street Bridge. Is this a city or a SAPS issue? I'll ask you, JP, for this one.
Enforcement of prostitution in terms of the Criminal Offences Act is for SAPS. Metro Police and law enforcement can also respond. It starts with making sure that you log the complaint, the 021-480-7700 when you see it. It's good for us to understand these kind of complaints when they come in a forum like this, but to relay that to Metro Police and say there's prostitution in X area, well, those problems exist along many hotspots across the city. So it is important to report the problem when it exists so that the officers can respond efficiently. Otherwise, they might go and inspect at a time when it's not happening, and the chance you had to make an arrest is then not effective. You are not likely to get much results in terms of the prosecution under the Sexual Offences Act. The last time SAPS did any meaningful in that regard was in Sea Point under the then station commander, Stunder, Maurice Stunder. SAPS have a fairly hands-off approach to this. So you have an almost effective decriminalization. And so the bulk of the enforcement rests on the city's shoulders in terms of the Streets and Public Places bylaw, which has 3 provisions that relate to prostitution in public places.
All right, thanks very much. So we're not going to get to all the questions. We're going to save them, and we will answer these questions via email or on our page. Thank you, everyone, for getting through these questions. The very last question I am going to ask is for Brandon, and it is, can you explain how to log a C3 service request?
Okay, so C3 service request, there'll hopefully be more mechanisms after our discussion earlier on with regards to logging. My personal preference is on the city's website, capetown.gov.za, service request, just search for it, or it'll be in your top right-hand tab. That is preferential because you verify all that information. It'll ask you quite specifically where it is. It'll make sure that it is tagged properly with the right category and subcategory. Failing that, what you'll do is you'll phone the city's call center. They'll take you through it. It's the second best option because sometimes the message is somebody else's. It's secondhand. It's not yours. You can SMS it to the city. You can't quite WhatsApp yet.
No, because WhatsApp have blocked that functionality. But the city is developing a citizen app, and in the case of safety and security, the meeting Brandon is referring to this morning, but there was a discussion about when that app will be ready. We were hoping to have it ready by the middle of this year, but unfortunately COVID did thwart our IT development efforts quite a bit. And so it might only be available by the end of the year. There will be an app that you can install and to log all of your emergency requests. And the benefit of that is by the time you do so, you as a user, you're registered on the system, your location is immediately pinpointed, and that saves quite a bit of time in terms of the call taker who then calls you back to confirm some of the information and allows us for far more effective response, especially in priority 1 and 2 cases where response time is urgent and critical, where you are witnessing an assault or an attempted rape or a crime which needs immediate response. So we're working to make that easier. 021-480-7700. About 87% of those calls are answered within the first 20 seconds. So that's 5 to 10 rings I find on average. There are times when they are busy, but generally you'll get a call quite quickly answered, and somebody will be there to speak to you in your language of choice.
Thanks
Assuming
very much.
those are one of the 3 official Western Cape languages.
Thanks very much. So we come to the end of our evening. I'm going to ask both panelists to closing remarks, 2 minutes each, on how lockdown has affected our ability to deliver community safety. And as our guest, I'm going to give it to you first, Alderman Smith.
So I think firstly, partnership. There's a lot that residents can do, whether it's active occupation of a park, neighborhood watches, active participation in civic or CPF structures, and so forth, using the rent-a-cop model, becoming active volunteers in disaster management volunteer service, or our city's law enforcement service. We're the only city in South Africa that has a police reserve service within the city in law enforcement. And there are quite a few reservists from this side of the city, from the Atlantic Seaboard and the City Bowl. And I'm quite proud of them. They do extraordinary work and they get amazing results. And we're very, very proud of them. The neighborhood watches are invaluable. They have a huge impact on property crime. You see that from the crime statistics where neighborhood watches are active. You see those property crime stats suppressed, the theft out of and theft of motor vehicles, robberies, residential, non-residential. They have a massive impact on property crime, and the partnerships that were born here and copied elsewhere around LPR cameras and neighborhood watch integration and hand radios have been invaluable, and we continue to build on those. And the lessons we learn in the CBD, we help establish in other parts of the city where by and large communities can't pay for these interventions themselves and where they're very often city funded. So there is a huge room for partnership. The CID is yet another form of that partnership that allows you then to contract staff and additional cleansing resources to drive urban regeneration. And for the rest of it, I think it's important that residents understand who runs what. The conversation we had earlier about the roles of national government and our roles, holding these judges to account, holding the courts to account, holding the prosecutors to account is important. They are persons with names, they have offices, and it can't be that the things they do that impact negatively on the community is never confronted. And equally so with an entity like the South African Human Rights Commission. It has a head. That head is the one who initiated the legal action. That is a person you can engage with. The Human Rights Commissioner, Chris Nissen, is somebody who should be explaining to the community why they took the actions they took, so that you can understand, because it is having very serious consequences across our city. And if you think you're angry, try and speak to residents in Khayelitsha where they qualified for accommodation. And keep in mind, many of the homeless persons you're talking about here do not qualify for housing, or they have had housing in some cases and have moved out of those houses or sold or renting it. And so in Khayelitsha, you can go walk with the Khayelitsha neighborhood watches, Dan and I did a few weeks ago, and where the mayor was told by residents how angry they were because the housing that they had qualified for, 1,100 opportunities in the one case, had been occupied. The site where approved housing plans were in place, approved budget was in place, had been occupied by unlawful land invaders, and people will forfeit their legitimate opportunity.
Thank you, Alderman. And your final closing remarks, please, Councillor Golding.
I think COVID lessons are kind of interesting. It has brought us closer, yet at the same point keeping us further apart. What it has done, though, is this. It's the tech platform. I'm finding that people are engaging much more via social media. I try to read all the WhatsApp groups, but I currently sit on 56 active ones because people who previously were worried about their missing cat are now talking. Neighbors are finally met in an online sense, not an offline sense. The parks are open, and we got your message about that clearly. There's a channel which is now opened up, and it's at a technical level. And this is something which is not going to disappear. We've invested money in camera setups. People are spending money on armed response because this is where we are at currently. And the city's looking at the growth in these platforms and how do we use this to interact with you as the resident and as the voter. So I'm going to close this off by saying, folks, this is the first one. This is the first one of this. We're going to ask you to raise matters which are topical. We've dealt with safety for now and homelessness. The next one I'd like to deal with is the economic impact. What you may not know, and I think Ian will be driving this, is the recovery of businesses in the CBD and surround. It's economic. We've taken a big knock. We spoke about jobs around homeless people, but it's jobs around everybody. It's money around everybody. It's got to do with tourism and hospitality and all the guest houses out there. And the city has got a plan.
Film and events sector.
Film and event sector is huge. So there's a plan in place. We are currently driving that. There's a policy around that. There's about 120 person working group down 7 streams. But Ian, you'll have to drive that at a later point with our sub-council. But we're going to chat to you about this because we'll need your inputs, because the COVID scare as it currently stands and the pandemic as it currently stands must and will end in its current form, and we have to move forward. There are matters which we will need to action from this session, which we've raised in terms of interventions. But the interventions is not just in the homeless space. The interventions in the everybody space, because there's a lot more things which you guys are impacted by. So I'm hoping that is our next topic. I want to touch on tourism as well. We're going to ask you that you contact us with recommendations. Email to us your recommendations around these following topics, and I'll prospectively get the relevant party members or maker members into the session where we can talk about what we hope and how you can help us. Thank you for joining us.
Ladies and gentlemen, as what we like to call active citizens, active citizenry, by joining us tonight, you are active citizens. We're going to put all the links and the details that we had tonight in this moderated session. So thank you to Alderman Smith, thank you to Councillor Golding, and thank you all for joining at home. Till next time, good night.